Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. A friend suggested we drive out to the old factory, located deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for decades, they said, left to rot after the industry moved elsewhere. No one had been there in years, and the idea of exploring an eerie, forgotten space seemed too intriguing to resist. We set off early in the afternoon, 3 of us packed into an old sedan. The drive was long, winding through narrow, overgrown roads until we finally reached the outskirts of the factory. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time. Tall, weathered brick walls covered in ivy, windows shattered and empty. The once mighty structure loomed over us, silent and still. We parked the car, and as we approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The place felt abandoned, sure, but not empty. There was a palpable sense of something watching, something that had never truly left. Inside, the factory was a maze of metal and decay. Broken machinery stood rusted and still, large gears covered in dust. The air smelled stale, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the empty halls, shining our flashlights on walls covered in graffiti, peeling paint, and remnants of what once was. At first, there wasn't much to see, just shadows stretching across the floor, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above. But as we moved deeper into the building, things began to feel wrong. It wasn't the faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't fear in the usual sense. More like an overwhelming sense of presence, something watching, following us. We kept moving, dismissing the feeling as overactive imaginations, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We reached what had once been the main hall, a vast expanse of cracked tiles and broken machinery. At the far end, partially hidden by a stack of debris, was a staircase leading to what looked like the second floor. We made our way towards it, stepping carefully through the clutter of fallen pipes and rusted metal. That's when we heard it. A low, faint groan, like metal twisting under pressure. We froze. It wasn't coming from the floor above, it was below. My stomach sank as I realized it was coming from the basement. The noise was distant, almost mechanical, but it felt wrong. I was about to suggest we leave when one of my friends, Jason, walked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls as he climbed. The sound continued, growing louder now, as if whatever made it was approaching. "Come on," Jason called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The others followed Jason down the creaking staircase, leaving me behind, my nerves frayed. I clutched my flashlight tighter, scanning the space. The noise had grown deafening now. Something was down there, something heavy. When I reached the bottom, the scene before me made my breath catch. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old machinery and storage crates. But what stood out were the deep, claw-like scratches etched into the floor, running from one end to the other. It was like something had dragged itself across the concrete, leaving long, deep marks behind. I tried to tell myself it was just decay, but the noises had stopped. The silence was now deafening. We all stood there, staring at the marks, when one of my friends let out a gasp. I followed his gaze, and there, in the far corner of the basement, was something I'll never forget. A figure, a tall, pale figure with hollow eyes, barely discernible in the dim light. It was partially obscured by shadows, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked onto us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jason was already moving toward it. His flashlight illuminated the figure, and for a moment we all stood frozen, unable to look away. Suddenly, the figure spoke, not with words, but with a low, inhuman hum that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. It wasn't a voice so much as a presence, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "We need to leave," one of my friends finally said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We fled up the staircase, the sound of the figure's hum fading behind us. My legs felt like jelly as we burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the darkness of the forest. But there, standing at the edge of the factory, was the figure. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about it again. But I know what I saw that night wasn't something from this world. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off, something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence, a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind, let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town, nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello." My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs, as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was a cool, quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old, deserted forest near my apartment. The trees there have always been tall and ominous, their branches tangled like they were reaching out toward something beyond. I had always felt a strange sense of peace walking through the woods, but that evening was different. It was getting late, and the sky had grown dark, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. I walked further than I usually did, deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves the only noise accompanying me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. The whisper repeated, growing louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I turned around, heart thudding in my chest. The forest behind me stretched out, dark and still, but there was something off about it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't have. I hurried back, my legs trembling, but the whisper followed me, always just out of reach. When I got home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the mind after spending too much time in the quiet. A week passed and I forgot about the whispers, until the second night. This time, I wasn't walking through the forest. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Fainter at first, but growing louder. The whispering came from the corner of my room. It was almost like a voice now, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering didn't stop. It was closer now, right by my ear. "Come with me," it said, and the words sent shivers down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes wide open, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. "You belong with us," it murmured. I covered my ears, but the sound was still there, filling my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed, and I felt a strange emptiness that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I had heard voices? No one would believe me. Days passed, and everything felt different. The whispering never stopped, though I tried to ignore it. It was always there, when I was alone, when I was in public. It followed me like a shadow, growing louder, more distinct. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I went back to the forest, driven by a need to understand what was happening. As I walked deeper into the trees, the whispering grew louder, until it was almost a scream. Then, in the dead silence of the woods, I saw them. Shapes, dark figures, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were shadows, but somehow they felt real. The whispering became clearer. "You hear us now," one said. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a collective, a chorus of countless voices. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't look away. The figures stretched toward me, their features twisted and distorted as though they had no faces, no identity, just voids of endless blackness. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures tilted their heads, a soft, eerie sound echoing through the forest. "But you do." I turned to run, but the figures followed as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. The whispering filled my ears, growing louder, until I could hear nothing else. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I woke up the next morning, lying on the ground, covered in dirt and leaves. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I was alive, but something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The whispers have never stopped. They still come to me in the quiet, always closer, always more persistent. And now, I know they'll never let me go. I still remember that trip to the old library. It wasn't like the modern ones with glass walls and computer stations. This library had a heavy, musty smell, old wooden shelves creaking beneath countless books, the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while wandering through a quiet, forgotten town. The library sat at the edge of a narrow, winding street. We were drawn to it, not by any plan, but by sheer curiosity. It looked abandoned, its windows cracked, paint peeling from the facade. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the wind, its faded letters barely readable. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the world. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light. I remember feeling a strange stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. There was no one there, just the four of us. We wandered through the aisles, running our fingers along the spines of the old books, their titles long forgotten. The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The silence seemed to throb, each creak of the wooden floorboards louder than it should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal resting on one of the shelves that things started to feel off. The journal was thick, its cover worn with age. I opened it, curious, and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, filled with strange symbols and passages that made no sense. Some entries were incomprehensible. Others spoke of things that shouldn't be known. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the scribbles, my hands trembling as I flipped further. But what truly unsettled me was a single line written on the very last page. It was as if someone had scrawled it in a panic, hurried and jagged. "They are watching. They have always been watching." I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Anything. But the library remained empty. The others were still exploring, oblivious to the unease that had taken hold of me. I hurried to put the journal back, but when I turned around, the air grew colder. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the same old shelves and the thick silence. My friends returned, laughing about some old book they'd found. I couldn't tell them about what I had seen. What if they thought I was imagining things? Or worse, what if they laughed it off like it was nothing? We stayed for a while longer, trying to enjoy the quiet atmosphere. But every so often, I felt those eyes again, watching, always watching. The feeling stayed with me long after we left the library, and to this day, I wonder who or what was there, waiting for us. I've always loved hiking, the kind of adventure that gets you far away from the noise of the city. So one weekend, I decided to explore a trail that few people talked about. It was located deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and valleys so remote, the maps barely showed any signs of civilization. My plan was simple: hike all day, set up camp, and enjoy the peace and quiet. The trailhead was nothing more than a narrow dirt path hidden behind a row of thick trees. The first few hours were perfect. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, birds chirped, and the air was crisp and fresh. The trail became steeper as I ascended, but I didn't mind. I relished the solitude, letting the quiet envelop me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to find a spot to set up my tent. I chose a small clearing near a stream, tucked away from the trail. It was picturesque, surrounded by towering evergreens and the soft trickling of water. I pitched my tent, unpacked some snacks, and settled down with a book, taking a deep breath of fresh mountain air. The silence was soothing at first, but as the day wore on, it started to feel oppressive. There was no wildlife, no rustling in the trees, no distant sounds of animals. It was as if the forest itself had gone completely still. I tried to push it aside, convinced I was imagining things. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, I decided to take a short walk by the stream. The water was clear and cold, the perfect spot to reflect. I stood there, mesmerized by the way the light danced on the surface until I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cool mountain air, it was something else entirely. I looked around, and the forest had become unnervingly silent. Even the breeze had stopped. The only sound now was the rushing water of the stream. I shook off the uneasy feeling and turned back toward my tent. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood there, perfectly still, staring at me. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. The head was tilted at an odd angle as if it couldn't quite move properly. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and unnatural. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, the stillness pressing in on me. I grabbed my pack and rushed back to the tent, every sound echoing too loudly in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. The wind returned, but it howled now, as if the forest itself was alive. Shadows danced around my tent, flickering in and out of view. Every creak of the tent fabric made me jump, my breath quickening with every passing second. At dawn, I packed up as fast as I could, leaving my campsite behind. I didn't care about the trail, about taking in the sights. All I wanted was to get back to the safety of the familiar world. As I stumbled down the trail, my heart still racing, I looked back one last time. The forest was still as quiet and empty as before. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever had been there, watching me, was still out there, waiting. It started as a simple trip to the old lighthouse, a place my family had visited countless times. We used to come here to watch the sunset, the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, the lighthouse casting its beam out over the water. This time, we decided to stay overnight, hoping for a quiet escape from the routine of life. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary at the edge of the rocky cliffs, its paint peeling and windows grimy from years of neglect. It wasn't operational anymore, but the view from the top was still breathtaking. Vast stretches of sea, endless skies, and the horizon meeting the horizon, uninterrupted. We set up our small tent a little ways down from the lighthouse, out of view from the old structure, and settled in for the evening. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the air became colder, the saltwater breeze sharp against my face. The sounds of the ocean became louder, more rhythmic, as if the waves themselves were trying to communicate. That's when things started to feel off. The usual quiet of the night was disrupted by strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the whispers weren't constant. They came and went, drifting in and out like ghostly echoes. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. My family was asleep in the tent, oblivious. Then I noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse, standing dark and foreboding, had always felt like a landmark, a safe beacon of light in the darkness. But now it felt different. It wasn't just that it was no longer operational. It felt like it had a presence of its own. I felt watched. I decided to climb up to the lighthouse, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The inside of the structure was cold and damp, the smell of aged wood and salt overwhelming. Dust particles danced in the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. I took the stairs to the top, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. At the top of the lighthouse, I stood in awe of the view. But as I looked out across the horizon, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, far below. It was too far for me to make out any details, but it stood motionless, like a statue. I squinted, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move. My heart pounded. I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried my voice away. I wanted to go back down, but something held me there. The figure remained, staring, unmoving. I turned to leave when I heard a sound, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind me. My blood ran cold. I was alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I spun around, expecting to see nothing, but there it was. A figure at the top of the stairs, eerily still, its face obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the figure following, its presence closer now as if it were breathing down my neck. When I reached the bottom, I bolted toward the tent, heart racing, the whispers now louder, more insistent. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, when my family woke, there was no sign of the figure, just the sound of the ocean and the wind. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had watched me from the cliff was still out there, waiting. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. I was in the middle of a road trip, driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost a signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. But the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something. Anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. But there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over. But deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple: take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now. Too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out into the hills. We weren't exactly sure where we were going, but that was part of the appeal. Just aimlessly exploring, watching the sunset over the valley, letting the world slip away. The winding road stretched ahead, surrounded by thick woods on either side. We were laughing, joking about nothing in particular, when we came across a narrow dirt path that cut off from the main road. It wasn't marked, barely noticeable, but curiosity got the best of us. "Let's see where it goes," one of my friends said, turning onto the path. The trees grew thicker as we followed the trail, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became, the only sound the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, shadows creeping longer as the light faded. After what felt like miles, we came across an old, decrepit cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and the door hung ajar like something had long since abandoned it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We stopped the car and got out, drawn by some strange compulsion. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay. The cabin stood there, a relic from a forgotten past, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The three of us hesitated, but something about the silence and the sense of isolation pulled us closer. Inside, it was colder than outside. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Old furniture lay overturned, forgotten and broken. It was as though no one had been here in decades. My friends and I moved cautiously, shining our flashlights into the corners of the cabin, peering through the debris. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the cabin. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. The cabin was small, too small for someone to be hiding. We had checked the whole place, every room, yet those footsteps kept moving, circling us, echoing louder as they drew closer. Panic set in. My friends were shouting, trying to make sense of it, but I was rooted to the spot. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by darkness. No eyes, no features, just a void where the face should have been. It moved closer, the footsteps still echoing, but now they were slower, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't seem to notice us, as if we were invisible. It reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the door frame, and then it simply disappeared. We didn't stay. We couldn't. My friends and I ran back to the car, not looking back, the silence of the woods pressing down on us as we tore down the path. The strange figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but the fear it left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a bad dream. Even now, I can't forget the stillness of the woods, the hollow echo of those footsteps, and the figure that no one could explain. Some things don't need answers to be terrifying. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon. but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with the grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above. The creaking of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow. But as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again, the figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. The night of the power outage was supposed to be like any other. I had decided to visit the nearby park for an evening walk, something I did regularly to clear my head. The park was large, surrounded by woods, and during the day it was a peaceful place, but at night it took on a different feel, isolated, mysterious. It was around 10 p.m. when I arrived. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. The park was completely empty. Not a single light from any street lamp or building. The power had gone out in the entire area earlier that evening, casting everything in deep, unnatural darkness. I didn't mind the quiet at first. In fact, it felt kind of serene. I continued walking down the main trail, the stars above me barely illuminating the path. It was peaceful, but something about the absence of light made the woods feel heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed closer, casting long, distorted shadows that shifted with the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine as I stopped and glanced around. The park was vast, stretching farther than I could see in the darkness. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but the silence was so complete it felt as though something was watching, waiting. I had no phone service, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. I picked up my pace, walking faster. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the woods seemed to close in more with each step. That's when I heard it, the sound of faint rustling behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching endlessly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No response. I listened harder, straining my ears, but the only thing I could hear was the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, nerves frayed. The trail twisted and turned, and soon I found myself farther from where I had entered. The forest seemed to grow denser, darker. I couldn't see the path anymore, the trees too thick. I stopped, realizing I was lost. Panic set in. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me had vanished. It was as though the woods had swallowed it whole. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as though something was lurking just beyond my vision, unseen but present. I tightened my jacket around me and forced myself to breathe, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze. My stomach twisted and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something told me otherwise. My name echoed once more, softer this time, as though the air itself was speaking it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. No response. My heart pounded louder now, a deafening rhythm in the stillness. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. I stumbled backward, bumping into something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. I spun around and froze. In front of me stood a figure, draped in what looked like tattered, flowing fabric. Its face was hollow, devoid of features, and its eyes gleamed faintly with an otherworldly light. It was taller than any person, and its presence felt ancient, unnatural. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a slow step forward, and I realized it wasn't walking. It glided, as though floating just above the ground. The woods seemed to press in around me, closing tighter, until there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, low and hollow. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around again, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished. I stood there trembling, my mind unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I turned and stumbled away from the spot, not looking back. The woods seemed endless, but somehow I found my way back to the edge of the park. By the time I made it home, the sun was beginning to rise. I never went back to that park again. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget it. It was supposed to be an ordinary trip, a simple afternoon drive through the countryside with my wife. We had rented a small, quirky cabin tucked away by a lake, a few hours from home. The idea was to escape the noise of the city and just spend some quiet time by the water. The drive there was uneventful. The winding roads were flanked by endless fields and dense forests. We passed a few scattered towns, but otherwise saw no one. It felt serene, almost like stepping back in time. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The place was exactly as advertised, isolated, surrounded by towering trees, with the lake just a short walk away. We unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and the distant hum of insects. By evening, we ventured down to the lake. It was calm, the water reflecting the colors of the sunset. We decided to take a walk along the shore, hand in hand, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. That's when it started. It began with faint whispers carried on the breeze. I didn't say anything at first, but I felt it, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I glanced at my wife, and I could tell she had heard it too. We stopped and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The whispers continued, growing louder, though the breeze was the only thing disturbing the stillness. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I replied, trying to keep calm, but my stomach twisted in knots. We decided to turn back toward the cabin. The feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. The whispering followed us, now indistinct, like murmurs too faint to understand. It felt like the trees themselves were watching. Back at the cabin, we locked the door and sat close together on the couch, trying to shake off the sense of unease. The whispers had stopped, but the silence now felt oppressive, as though something was waiting just beyond our perception. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up, straining to hear. The wooden floor creaked under heavy, uneven movement. I nudged my wife awake and we both listened, our ears pressed to the wall. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin as if something was moving around, studying us from the outside. "Is someone out there?" my wife whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry. The steps continued, now sounding closer, more distinct. I could hear breathing now, slow, shallow breaths that didn't belong to any living person. In a desperate attempt to break the tension, I grabbed my phone to call for help. But the screen stayed black. No signal. Nothing. My hands shook as I set it down. Then came a new sound. The knocking. Soft at first, but persistent. The knocks came from the windows, as though something was testing them, probing, searching for a way in. I pressed my back against the bed, the cold wall pressing against my skin. It was like they knew we were there. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. The whispers returned, but this time they were right outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as though whatever was out there was trying to tell us something. Something we couldn't hear, something we couldn't comprehend. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. My wife and I sat motionless, afraid to move. Eventually, we must have drifted back to sleep, though the unease lingered with us. In the morning, there was nothing. No trace of anyone or anything. The lake was calm, the trees stood still, and the whispers had faded with the night. But I know what I heard, what we both experienced. And even now, when I think about it, I feel the weight of those moments, of something that wasn't meant to be there, something that was watching, waiting. I never understood what it was, and I hope I never have to again. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there. just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a calm evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the beach. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sand as we arrived. We parked near the shore, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. There were only a few scattered families and a couple of couples enjoying the evening, but the vast beach felt almost empty. The horizon stretched endlessly, the ocean in front of us glowing with the fading light of the day. We set up a small bonfire, sitting on the warm sand, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows. The sound of the waves was soothing, and the cool breeze carried the smell of the sea. For a while, everything felt perfect. It was one of those simple moments you cherish. Good company, good weather, and nothing but the vast ocean around you. As the night deepened, we got lost in conversation, laughing and sharing stories. Time slipped away. At some point, I noticed the others had fallen into a comfortable silence, gazing out at the water. I turned to look at them, but something felt off. The ocean was unusually quiet. There was no typical hum of waves crashing against the shore, no seagulls squawking. It felt still, as though the entire beach had been frozen in time. I got up and walked to the edge of the water, the sand cooling beneath my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, the darkening sky blending with the sea. But that silence, it gnawed at me, crawling under my skin. A faint glow emerged from the water, far out beyond the waves. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the moon, but the light wasn't reflecting off the surface. It was coming from beneath it. A pulse, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat. I called out to my friends, but no sound came from my mouth. I turned around to them, but they weren't there anymore. I was alone. Panic set in as I turned back to the ocean. The glow was closer now, stretching closer to the surface. I could see it more clearly, an unnatural, eerie light that seemed to come from something below. A figure emerged from the water, pale and translucent. Its face was obscured, its body skeletal, almost ghost-like. It didn't move like a living thing. It glided toward me with a slow, unsettling grace, the light from beneath its form illuminating the dark waters. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to look away. The creature came closer, and I could feel its presence invading my mind, as if it had seen straight through me. The air was thick, and the sound of the waves had vanished entirely. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The figure stopped, its shadow stretching toward me. But it didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel the weight of its gaze, its intent, silent and suffocating. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the water, vanishing without a trace. The ocean returned to its restless state, waves crashing against the shore once more. The sound returned, but it no longer felt familiar. The beach was empty again, and my friends had never been there. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the vast, dark ocean. Alone. Whatever had come from the water was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It had taken something with it, something I couldn't explain, and I was left wondering if it would ever come back. It was a summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned amusement park just outside of town. The place had always been off limits, but rumors had circulated for years about how eerie it had become after being shut down. Overgrown with weeds, faded signage, and cracked pavement stretching as far as the eye could see, the park was a relic from a time long gone. We figured we'd go check it out, just for the thrill of it. The sun was setting as we made our way through the rusting entrance gates. Everything about the place felt surreal. The Ferris wheel, once a shining beacon of joy, stood now as a towering, skeletal structure swaying gently in the breeze. Most of the rides were broken or tilted at odd angles, their once bright colors dulled and faded by years of neglect. We wandered further into the park, snapping photos, laughing and making jokes about how haunted it probably was. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the wind carried the creaking sounds of metal swaying. Even the smallest things, the chirping of insects, the soft rustling of leaves, felt amplified, as if the silence of the park had grown too loud. At some point, we decided to split up. It wasn't exactly planned, but we were curious to explore more, and with no cell service, it didn't matter much. The sun was nearly gone now, and the park was shrouded in deepening shadows. My group stayed near the old roller coaster, the tracks buckling in several places, making the whole structure look like it could collapse at any moment. That's when we heard it, the sound of distant laughter. It wasn't ours. It was coming from further inside the park, echoing through the hollow spaces between rides and buildings. I froze, the laughter sharp and unsettling, like it didn't belong here. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing at my friends. They shrugged it off as more of the creepy ambiance, but something in the sound felt wrong, like it wasn't the playful kind of laughter you expect in an amusement park. It was hollow, distorted, as if coming from something that shouldn't be alive. We stood there, unsure, but before we could move, we heard it again. Closer this time. Louder. The sound seemed to be circling the park, following us without ever appearing. The chill in the air grew stronger, and the excitement that had been buzzing earlier was replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Let's head back," someone said, their voice quivering. We all agreed, eager to leave, but as we began walking, the laughter came again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was multiple voices. They echoed all around us, overlapping, as if we were surrounded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The path we had taken seemed longer than it should have, and with each step, the laughter grew louder and more distorted. Shadows danced in the fading light, shifting unnaturally in ways that no wind or movement could create. Then came the creaking of the Ferris wheel. It was slow at first, like something winding itself into motion, but we didn't hear the sounds of it turning, only the groans of metal under unseen pressure. Suddenly, it stopped. The laughter had ceased entirely. We turned around, breath catching in our throats. Standing beneath the giant wheel, framed in the dim light, was a figure, tall, pale, and eerily still. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but there was no mistaking the outline of its form. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us, waiting. We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. We ran, heart pounding, sprinting through the park as fast as we could, the echoes of our own footsteps and the distant laughter still ringing in our ears. We never looked back. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude, but tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. "Help." I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help. Please." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. "I'm here. Please." I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't I can't get out." I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering, growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate. and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. I remember the day clearly. It wasn't anything special, just a regular evening in an old, crumbling city. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world had paused. I was walking home from the library after a long day of studying. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the cracked pavement. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I decided to take a shortcut through an alley. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. I reached the mouth of the alley when I heard a soft, uneven scraping sound behind me. I froze. My breath caught, and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, maybe a homeless person or a cat. But there was nothing. The alley stretched behind me, empty and dark. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step backward, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I scanned the space again, hoping to find some rational explanation for the noise. There was nothing. I continued walking, but the unease lingered. The scraping sound echoed in my mind, growing louder with every step. I glanced back one last time and saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the alley, obscured by the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt its presence in my bones. My legs felt frozen, like I couldn't move. The figure remained still, watching, as though it was waiting for me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw another shadow, just to my left. This one was closer, much closer. I could feel its cold breath on my neck as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Panic set in. I started running, my footsteps echoing through the alley, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every turn I took, there was always something watching, always a presence just out of reach. Eventually, I found myself at the end of the alley, my chest heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets stretched out before me, quiet as ever. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but the silence was worse than the fear. It wasn't until I turned to leave the alley that I saw them again. 3 figures, standing perfectly still, watching me from across the street. Their faces were hidden, shadows consuming them, but I could feel their gaze as if they were right beside me. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I forced myself to look away and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe inside my apartment. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. The silence of the night was broken only by my own trembling breath. I don't know what those figures were, or what they wanted. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before, and I hope I never feel it again. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home along the old highway, a stretch of road I'd traveled countless times before. The highway was long, desolate, cutting through empty fields that stretched on for miles. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just me and the endless blackness. As I drove, I noticed something strange. About halfway home, I passed a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was someone stranded, maybe they lived nearby, but as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I realized they were still there, walking in the same direction. I didn't see their face, only the silhouette of someone in a dark coat. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and they walked as though they didn't notice my car at all. My instinct told me to stop, to ask if they needed help, but something about their movements didn't sit right. They weren't stumbling or waving for help. They just kept walking, their figure blending into the darkness like they belonged there. I kept driving, the unease growing in my gut. I checked the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, now further back, just as distant and unchanging as before. By the time I reached the next bend, the figure was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, relieved. Maybe they'd turned off the road, or found whatever they were looking for. But as I approached the next stretch of road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing there, just a few feet from where I had last seen them. This time, they were facing the road. Their head was tilted, watching me as I drove closer. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. There was something about the way they moved, so slow, so deliberate, that sent a chill through me. I could feel their gaze locked onto my car. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself they were just lost, maybe trying to get to a destination. But that thought didn't comfort me. There was something deeply unnatural about how still they stood, how they didn't react to the passing cars or the distant sound of my horn. As I approached, I noticed the figure wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, off into the horizon as though something far beyond the road had their attention. I hesitated, watching in horror as they began to move again, this time walking toward the trees at the edge of the field. I didn't stop to watch. I sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was that? Why were they walking down the highway like that, so out of place? When I finally made it home, the house felt too quiet. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe they were a hitchhiker who wandered off into the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The figure wasn't normal. They had felt off, wrong, in ways I couldn't explain. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see them again, standing in the darkness, watching. I've never driven that stretch of road again. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions, just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite. But no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. I never believed in the old tales they told about the abandoned factory. It was a relic of the past, a place everyone in town seemed to avoid. Rumors of shadows, whispers, and things that went bump in the night had always seemed like just that. Rumors. But I was never one to fear the unknown, at least not until that night. I had always heard stories from my parents and older folks about the factory, how it had been shut down decades ago after a series of strange occurrences, machinery running on its own, lights flickering and whispers echoing through the empty halls. But no one I knew had actually dared to enter it until that night. It was a few weeks after the factory officially closed down for good, and curiosity got the better of me. A few friends and I decided to explore. The building was towering, windows shattered, rusted beams sagging. The front doors creaked as we pushed them open, the air inside heavy with the scent of decay. We stepped cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, flashlight beams cutting through the thick shadows. We wandered through empty hallways filled with old machinery, cracked concrete, and scattered bits of broken equipment. It was like walking through the echoes of the past. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. I started feeling like we were being watched. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just the echoes of our own footsteps. We stopped in what once must have been a break room. A long, faded table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The silence in the room was oppressive. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above us, barely hanging on. That's when it started. The faint whispering. It was so soft at first, barely audible, like someone was talking just on the edge of hearing. I froze, trying to make sense of it, but the others didn't seem to notice. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, the old building settling, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, more distinct. I took a step toward the hallway, my friends still gathered around the table. The whispers were clearer now, and they sounded wrong. It was like they weren't coming from anywhere. The words were faint, but they seemed to be repeating the same thing over and over, like a distorted echo. Leave. 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 I tried to call out to my friends, but the words caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to replace the batteries, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely manage. "Guys," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." I heard a low, raspy laugh behind me, cold and hollow. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The whispers had stopped, but the air grew colder. I could feel a presence in the room now, something that wasn't human. I heard it then. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the hall. They weren't my friends' footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. I backed away, stepping carefully until I felt the wall press against my back. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. "Leave. Leave. Leave," they seemed to chant, their distorted voices weaving into the air. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely, plunging the room into total darkness. My friends' voices echoed faintly, calling out for me from deeper in the building, but I couldn't find them. I fumbled with my phone, but it was dead. The only sound now was the relentless whispering, growing louder, more urgent. I held my breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, but nothing ever did. Somehow, I found my way out, back through the winding halls, past the echoes of those whispers. My friends never believed me when I told them. To this day, they think I imagined it, that it was just some old factory with nothing more than dust and creaking metal. But I know what I heard, and sometimes, even now, I can still hear the whispers, just faint enough to make my skin crawl. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, "Eagle Point, 5 miles." I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there. just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It started on a quiet summer evening. I was driving down the winding country road, away from the lights of the city and toward the small, rural town I called home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, orange glow behind the trees. I wasn't in a rush. The journey was peaceful. Nothing but open fields stretching out on either side of the road. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, just a text from a friend reminding me to take the back route. The usual traffic's a nightmare, they'd said. I smiled and checked the screen. Sure enough, there were no cars ahead, no one behind me. The road was empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, I felt the weight of the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over me. It was so different from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized how still they were. The figure didn't move. No wave, no glance, just standing there, perfectly still, like a mannequin. I passed them without slowing down, my pulse quickening. I told myself they were probably just lost, maybe hitchhiking. But the image of that unmoving figure stuck with me. A few miles further, I came across another one, and this time closer to the edge of a small, overgrown field. The figure stood just a few feet from the road, completely still, staring off into the distance. I passed by, this time slower, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There were more. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I had counted 5. All of them standing still at the side of the road, staring into the darkness, unmoving. I was just about to dismiss the whole thing when a shiver ran down my spine. What if they weren't people? What if they weren't even real? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Not just standing there waiting, but following. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized something else. They hadn't moved. I made it back safe, but the silence of that night, the sight of those figures, still haunts me. I still drive that road sometimes, hoping to find some explanation, but I never do. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then, I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I never thought a simple trip to the library could haunt me like that. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just finished dinner and decided to visit the library downtown. I'd always loved the quiet, the smell of old books, the calmness of the place. It was something I did regularly, but that night felt different. The library was quiet, like usual, with only a few people scattered around, their heads buried in books or computers. I liked the peaceful hum of pages turning and the faint sound of the old fluorescent lights buzzing above. It felt like time moved slower there. I spent the evening reading, drifting through the stacks until I found myself in the back of the building. That's where the old section was, filled with dusty aged books no one really touched. It was peaceful, almost serene. But something was off. I remember feeling like I was being watched. The feeling started slowly, creeping up on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, but nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to leave, but as I passed the long row of bookshelves, I noticed something strange. At the end of the row stood a figure, tall and thin, just standing there in the dim light. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its posture was unnervingly unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that didn't belong, something wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered my name, soft but chilling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and tried to yell for help, but the sound got caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared between the rows of books. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether I had imagined it or not. The whispering continued, though fainter now, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the library. I rushed to the entrance, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I glanced back one last time. The library was still. Too still. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered once before dying out, plunging the building into darkness. I never went back to that library. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, but the whispering still lingers in the back of my mind, and I'll never forget the figure that vanished between the rows of books. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something or someone was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess. Old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all: a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves. Just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound, barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent, almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers, until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, Everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open, but what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was late summer, and I'd gone on a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. My usual companions had fallen through, but I felt an odd pull to get away from everything and find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day was perfect. The forest stretched out in every direction, vast and untouched. I set up my tent near a small stream, and the sound of running water helped calm my restless mind. There were no signs of other people, no other sounds except for the occasional rustling of leaves and birdsong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how peaceful it all felt. I'd grown so used to the noise of city life, and now, surrounded by nothing but nature, it was like the world had slowed down. I didn't feel the usual anxiety or stress that had followed me in recent months. But as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake. Something had rustled outside. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was still, save for the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. The night passed in silence after that. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The forest can play tricks on you, and my overactive imagination was likely running wild. By morning, I was ready to forget the incident. But as I broke camp, I noticed something strange. Around my tent, the ground was uneven, disturbed. It looked like something heavy had walked through during the night, leaving deep, uneven prints. I followed the trail they made, huge, unnatural footprints that seemed to lead away from the stream and deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears roamed these parts, sure, but the tracks were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were too large, the stride too long. I tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. That afternoon, as I ventured further into the forest, something shifted. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, became distant, faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. There was nothing. No breeze, no distant rustling. Just silence. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized how alone I was. At first, I thought of turning back, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, deeper into the woods, following the trail of those strange footprints. I don't know how long I walked, lost in thought and the eerie stillness of the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, one that had no right to be there. It wasn't a natural formation, but rather, it felt carved out. The trees surrounding it stood unnaturally still, their branches twisting toward the ground as if weighed down by unseen forces. In the center of the clearing stood something I can't fully explain. It was humanoid, though not human. Its form was obscured, shadowy, and indistinct, like it was made of fog. I could barely make out its shape, but its presence felt palpable, almost suffocating. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at it, unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was something real. The creature, if that's what it was, turned its head slowly in my direction. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me. Cold, empty, and infinite. Something in its presence made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty once more, as though it had never been there at all. I turned and stumbled back, not sure how far I had come. My mind was racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like I was being followed, though I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my tent, I didn't stop. I packed everything in a daze and left, not looking back at the deep woods that had become so foreign. I don't know what I saw that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, that the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But the footprints, they were real. The figure in the clearing, whatever it was real. I've never gone back to the woods since,